I found that there's a coffee shop in North Dakota called The Vault, and they offer their customers to pay for their coffee on a sliding scale. Instead of there being one particular price, like $4 or $5 for a coffee, customers actually have the option of paying less. And believe it or not, they found a 15% increase in their profit. And that's because on the higher scale, for those who have the option, they're able to donate more. And this actually balances out for those who pay less. Do not become merely a recorder of facts, but try to penetrate the mystery of their origins. And this was said by Ivan Pavlov. Do you recall when your first influences took place? Do you have any memory around your earliest influences? And chances are you don't, because they occurred in utero. And this is because, on a fundamental level, influence is actually the product of your sensory input being processed by your subconscious. Your sensory input being your sense of taste, smell, sound, vision. And of course that begins with the development of your sensory organs. And this occurred in utero. For example, at 8 weeks gestation, your sense of smell is already developing. Upon being born, an infant already has 10,000 taste buds and all of the flavors: umami, bitter, sweet, sour, salty. In utero, a developing fetus is also swallowing up to 1 liter of amniotic fluid a day. And as a result of this, depending on what the mother is eating, upon being born, an infant or a baby has an affinity to certain foods and also an aversion to certain foods that they weren't exposed to. And on the other side of things, you have allergies, which are actually a result of a lack of exposure to certain stimuli. And this is because without an exposure, once you're introduced, it's brand new and it's a shock to the immune system. There hasn't been any time to adapt and calibrate. So therefore it causes a heightened inflammatory type of response. Your immune system is kicked into high gear, high defense mode. So this brings us to a couple of different theories. Perhaps when a mother is experiencing cravings, it's actually, on some level, the fetus gauging the resources available in the environment in order for it to prepare to adapt accordingly to those resources that are available. Perhaps it's the genes interacting already with the environment, making the necessary preparatory steps, again, in order to optimize the survival of the infant. And this brings us once again to epigenetics. Epigenetics really being at the heart of influence, the heart of change and adaptation. And our understanding of epigenetics actually began with research into the Dutch famine. The Dutch famine study. The Dutch famine occurred in the 1940s, around the time of World War II, the end of World War II. And there's a community in Denmark in which members of the community were consuming only 400 to 800 calories a day. And now they found that generations later, so their grandchildren, there's a direct correlation between people, members of the communities in which this famine was occurring, and people who had diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And it turned out that certain genes were activated as a result of the famine, and these genes being activated were actually carried forth multiple generations down. And this is because diabetes actually serves as a beneficial response in times of a famine. So you have a spike in your insulin, and that increases the storage of fat, and that's actually a good thing when you're in a crisis around starvation. This is the body's natural defense mechanism taking place. However, many generations later, the environment no longer was relevant to that type of defensive reaction. There was no longer a famine taking place. So that's where you have high rates of diabetes going on. Sharon Mullum, in his book Survival of the Sickest, highlights a number of examples similar to the one that I just gave you on diabetes. But in particular, he explains a scenario around September 11th in New York City. And it turns out that there were increased rates of miscarriages all the way over in California, particularly for women carrying males. And this is because, as it turns out, males are a lot more taxing physiologically to carry. They demand a lot more resources. So the body's natural response is to miscarry in order to preserve and optimize the survival of the mother so that she can later on carry future offspring. And Sharon Mullum actually calls this the automatic conservation mechanism. And again, it's around a natural defense mechanism taking place automatically on a subconscious level in order to optimize the survival of the mother, therefore future offspring. Actually supports this idea in that a lack of exposure in utero and early infancy to certain foods, for example, actually increases the chances of allergies developing later in life. Essentially from the moment of conception, our genes are interacting with our environment. As soon as that sensory information is available to process, we're processing it, and we use it to adapt, to optimize our survival. And the bittersweet part of acknowledging influence and understanding, especially the field of epigenetics, is that we no longer have that excuse or reason to disregard the way in which our actions have an impact.